Chapter 31, Miriam. As the weeks turned to months, Ari's strange street encounter, instead of fading into the past, seemed all the more vivid and troublesome. There was no way he could deny its reality, though he wasn't sure what that meant in relation to an intelligence that would take on different forms, do the impossible, and appear and disappear apparently at will. His undergraduate work in physics had, in a sense, prepared him for something so bizarre. In the world of subatomic particles, the impossible happened all the time. But to see it in the mundane world of everyday experience was mind-boggling. It was also very disturbing. So much that Elor had said made good sense. There was no doubt that the new freedom in Eastern Europe wasn't the cure-all. Though bastions of freedom, Western democracies were seething cauldrons of racism and bigotry, with increasing crime, mushrooming debt, and monumental selfishness that left little hope of ever seeing the kind of compassionate caring for others that was so obviously needed. The transformation of the heart that Elor spoke of with such conviction was definitely needed, but he had declined to explain how that would come about. Ari was most uncomfortable with the role that had supposedly been assigned to him. Yes, it did fit ideas that he had already formulated, such as that Israel must give up its chosen people delusion and Zionist madness. That confirmation gave him a good feeling about Elor, but it hardly made up for the nagging apprehension. This business of higher consciousness, traveling to California to meet the man who would oversee this new world of love and brotherhood, and himself becoming some kind of messiah, all of that made him feel uneasy. In the meantime, life went on, and he continued to enjoy his work and build up a loyal following of admiring readers. The enigmatic David Cawley dropped by frequently in the evening for the discussions with Yaakov that both seemed to relish so much, and into which Ari had increasingly been drawn despite his initial reluctance. No matter where their conversations started these days, they always came around to the same argument: whether Israel should ignore the wishes and assurances of the United States and make a preemptive strike on Iraq's Scud missiles before Saddam used them against Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, which would certainly be its primary targets. David and Yaakov were in full agreement that Israel would eventually have to act, but could not decide upon the timing. A preemptive strike would be a disaster for Israel's public image, argued Ari one evening. The three friends were seated comfortably in front of the picture window, watching the lights go on one by one across the city as the dusk deepened. Ari had become increasingly dogmatic in arguing against a preemptive strike. He had just written a persuasive article presenting that viewpoint. It had brought more critical letters than the Post had received in years. "There's just no doubt," continued Ari, "that such unilateral action would split the Allied coalition confronting Iraq, putting that effort in jeopardy. And for sure it would seem to justify the animosity of the Arab coalition partners against Israel. Saddam would become a hero again. You'd have rabid crowds demonstrating in every Arab city of any size." "You may be right about that," conceded David, "but the safety of our civilian population is the number one priority." The three of them sat in thoughtful silence for a few moments. At last Ari asked, "How is it possible to live in Israel without becoming paranoid? That question has been bothering me lately." "What do you mean?" demanded Yaakov a bit testily. "Are you suggesting that it's paranoia to take steps to prevent Saddam from using his missiles in a chemical attack against Israel? He's repeatedly threatened to do exactly that." "In the Defense Department," cut in David, "we take the threat very seriously." "I didn't mean that specifically," said Ari. "I'm talking in general terms. I've been here nearly 8 months now, and I find myself developing more of a siege mentality every day. I sense the same attitude among people in the streets, like the whole world is against us." "Maybe they are," responded Yaakov solemnly. "See, that's what I mean," retorted Ari quickly. "It's a paranoia that goes with being here, and I don't want to be caught up in it." "And you don't think there's sufficient justification to have a siege mentality when you're surrounded by enemies who are just waiting for the chance to destroy you? I thought you'd begun to see that months ago." There was disappointment in Yaakov's voice. I'm not denying that there's some justification, conceded Ari, but you can't live with a chip on your shoulder and blame everyone else for the inevitable feeling of hostility. It's in the air here in Israel. Just let anyone dare to knock it off. There's some truth in what he's saying, admitted David. We've talked about that for years. We probably made some mistakes in what we did in Lebanon. Hair trigger reactions are dangerous. As time passed, Ari had come to the conclusion that David wasn't a Mossad agent after all. He was convivial, urbane, well-informed, and widely traveled, and just plain normal in an engaging way. He was also a fountainhead of extremely interesting information, both about Israeli and Arab politics. That know-how had been a great help to Ari in understanding the Middle East better. Ari had even used some of David's ideas in his newspaper columns. David had, in fact, become a good friend. Yaakov ignored David's attempt to be agreeable. One had to beware of being too soft on new immigrants. "Have you ever been to Yad Vashem?" he asked Ari. "Yad Vashem?" "The Holocaust Museum." "I've been avoiding it," confessed Ari. "How can you write for the Post if you don't thoroughly understand the Holocaust? In fact, you can't." Yaakov was irate. "You've commended me," responded Ari defensively. "I've gotten lots of letters from readers who like what I'm writing." "Yes," said Yaakov in a more conciliatory tone. "You've done a good job, up to a point, and I know you're gaining a following, but there's a missing dimension of deep conviction in some of what you write. You need to go to Yad Vashem." I know, I should, and I will," conceded Ari ungraciously. "But the Holocaust's been dealt with, again and again. It's not healthy to be forever dredging up the past. It just adds to the paranoia. I'm writing about current events." "The world must never forget," countered Yaakov heatedly. "The victims died for nothing unless their memory can be kept alive. It's the only way to prevent another horror of the same dimensions. Never again is our motto and determination. That's the message of Yad Vashem. You must see it soon." A knock on the door punctuated the urgency in Yaakov's voice. The old man jumped up with a cry of joy and hurried into the small entry hall. He seemed to recognize every visitor's individual knock. He opened the door to a smartly dressed woman in her late 30s with long, curly jet-black hair and dark, twinkling eyes, amazingly like Yaakov's. Her face seemed to light up when she smiled. "Surprise!" she exclaimed. "Miriam!" bellowed Yaakov, as though he were announcing her arrival to all of Jerusalem. They fell into one another's arms, embracing with great fervor. Although she was several inches taller than he, Yaakov's ardent hug lifted her off her feet. Come in," he cried, taking her by the arm and leading her into the living room. "This is my granddaughter, Miriam Zaira, from Tiberias," he announced proudly. "You know David, of course. And this is Ari Thalberg from Paris, a Holocaust survivor and my new housemate. Remember, I told you about him." Miriam smiled and nodded a greeting, then reached out and shook hands with David and Ari. "Am I interrupting some important meeting?" she asked apologetically, stepping back as though to leave. "I can come back later." Yaakov took her by the arm again and propelled her into an empty, overstuffed chair next to his ancient rocker. "Don't you dare try to escape. When do I ever see you anymore? You'd think Tiberias was on the other side of the world." "Now, Grandpa," she protested, "I get up here quite often." "You do? Well, Ari's never met you, and he's been here 8 months." "I just spent 6 months in Europe on my sabbatical, remember?" "Yes, and you've been back more than a month, and this is the first time you've gotten up here. Are you staying at Deborah's?" Miriam nodded. "Yes, this is a long weekend for the school system." She turned to David and Ari, who were still standing and looking a bit awkward. "I must have interrupted an important discussion, if I know Grandpa." "Yes, we were having a go at it," said Yaakov quickly, "and we're going to carry on. Sit down, you two." He turned to Ari. "Miriam teaches in a high school. She could give you some lessons about Israel's history that would be very helpful." "Now, Grandpa, don't start bragging about me. I'm sure he knows a lot more about history than I do. I read his columns in the Post, and he seems very knowledgeable." Knowledgeable, cut in Yaakov. He's abysmally ignorant about almost everything that's important in relation to Israel. Miriam turned to Ari with an apologetic smile. By now you must be used to the dear man's scoldings. He does that with everyone. I feel sorry for you having to endure this all the time. The look of affection that passed between Miriam and Yaakov belied her words. Let me bring you up to date, Miriam, continued Yaakov. We were discussing whether Israel ought to make a preemptive strike against Saddam's Scuds. Ari thought we were paranoid even to suggest such a thing, and when you knocked, he was just telling us that the Holocaust is ancient history that would be better forgotten. Miriam was too well-bred to look startled. That observation embarrassed Ari momentarily. I didn't exactly say that, protested Ari, feeling compelled to explain. Your grandfather is twisting my words, which he does frequently. You probably know he's a master at that. To his surprise, he was suddenly concerned that this personable woman whom he had just met should not have a bad impression of him. I'm shocked that you'd make such an accusation, interjected Yaakov, pretending to be highly offended. I was just commenting, continued Ari, defending himself to all three, that, well, I wouldn't dare express it journalistically, of course, but it seems to me that the Jews, at least a great many of them, have a persecution complex. I've developed one myself since moving here. I know there's a fresh wave of anti-Semitism sweeping the world, but I keep coming back to the question, why should Jews, any more than any other minority group, feel so threatened? Does our paranoia help to bring at least some of our problems upon us? Yes, why Jews, returned Yaakov bitterly. We have to face that question. Are we so loathsome? Is that why we've been hated and hounded to death down through history? That was the first thing we talked about, Ari, remember? Ari nodded, regretting that he had raised the issue, sensing that he was going to get another religious lecture. You can't deny the universal animosity toward us, continued Yaakov earnestly, and I defy anyone to come up with any explanation for such hatred, except the one presented in both the Torah and many other parts of the Bible, including the New Testament. We're hated because we're God's chosen people, and we disobeyed him, and this is his judgment upon us. Pretty harsh judgment, muttered Ari. Is that the only benefit of being chosen? To be punished? To whom much is given, of him shall much be required, said Miriam softly. That's what Jesus of Nazareth, the greatest of the rabbis, said. Jesus of Nazareth? Ari immediately recoiled at the name. He glanced over at David and, with satisfaction, noted that he looked uncomfortable as well. Yaakov continued as though he and Miriam had rehearsed it all ahead of time. Moses said that through Israel the Messiah would come and all the nations of the earth would be blessed. That's a heavy responsibility, and to fail to live up to it, and Israel has failed, must carry severe consequences. And I'm no more ready to accept that myth now than I was when we first met, countered Ari irritably. He looked over to David for support, but he just threw up his hands and shrugged. A journalist should respect the truth, replied Yaakov quietly. You call it a myth that God chose Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and gave their descendants this land? Asked Miriam in genuine surprise. We study Jewish history right out of the scriptures. It's accepted in Israel's school system as accurate, or we wouldn't use it. In fact, it's the most accurate record we have. I'm not a total atheist, muttered Ari lamely. But he's close, countered Yaakov quickly. He's very touchy about the idea that a personal God might have some definite plan for mankind, and especially that we Jews could have a special role to play in that plan. Maybe I'm overly sensitive, admitted Ari, but it upsets me to see anyone taken up with superstition in a scientific world. I'll drop the subject, promised Yaakov, because I know it makes you uncomfortable. But it's unfair to call what I believe superstition without proving that it is, which you can't. And I can prove it's not superstition if you're inclined to listen someday. I'm simply stating the undeniable fact that the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have always been persecuted and hounded to the death like no other people. That's history, and the present reality. Here, Yaakov turned to David. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you? David nodded. I'm with you that far. No ethnic group in the history of the world has been persecuted so consistently over as long a period of time as the Jewish people, and with the clear intent to exterminate them. Okay, said Yaakov with an air of triumph. In that respect, at least, we all agree. The evidence is irrefutable that the Jews are absolutely unique in the persecution they've received down through the centuries. The phenomenon is too consistent to be explained by chance, so there has to be a reason. And until you have a better explanation, I'll stick with mine. But the world has come a long way since Hitler. There couldn't be another Holocaust today, insisted Ari. There won't be, cut in David, but only because we won't allow it. Never again. We are now capable of defending ourselves. We couldn't in the 30s and early 40s, and we're not going to let the world forget the unthinkable evil that happened then. That's why Yad Vashem was created. Yaakov's right. You need to see it. Okay, responded Ari defensively. I'll go and report back on my impressions. How's that? Just don't put it off, chimed in Yaakov. Get to it. Ari looked at Miriam in mock pain. You can see how they batter me around. Who knows what consequences I'll suffer at their hands if I don't get to the Holocaust Museum immediately. Let me rescue you, then, offered Miriam. Why don't I take you? Can you go tomorrow morning? I don't want to put you to that trouble, demurred Ari, feeling embarrassed as their eyes met. No trouble at all, insisted Miriam. It would be my pleasure. It's a huge place, more than just the main building. Most of the exhibits only have a title to identify them, with little or no explanation. You really need a guide. Unless you'd rather be alone. No, I'd rather be with you than be alone. I mean, it's nice to have someone explain things. It would be very kind of you. Done, Miriam said with a gracious smile. I'd consider it a privilege to take a Holocaust survivor through Yad Vashem. It will be a wonderful experience for both of us. How about 10 o'clock tomorrow morning? I'll be ready, agreed Ari gratefully. It would be the first time he'd been alone with a woman since Nicole had walked out on him. With a quick hug for Yaakov and a promise to see him again before she returned to Tiberias, Miriam was gone.